Welcome to today's historical deep dive. Is the greatest revolutionary actually just the ultimate kingmaker for himself? We think of Napoleon as the general, the strategist, the man who remade Europe with cannon fire. But his most audacious victory wasn't on a battlefield. It was in a cathedral, on a cold December day, where he didn't just take a throne, he built one from the ground up, brick by brick, symbol by symbol. If you love immersive, real, drop a comment with your favorite Napoleon quote or the moment that shocked you most. Let's begin and change the way you think about history. You stand in the echoing vastness of Notre Dame, December 2nd, 1804. The air is thick with incense, ambition, and the hushed anticipation of thousands. Before you, atop a velvet cushion, rests the crown of France, a symbol stripped of its monarchy barely a decade ago, now awaiting a new head. This isn't just a ceremony. It's a defiant declaration, a meticulously staged drama where the lead actor seizes the ultimate prop of power. This moment embodies the principle of ambition's final, visible step, the leap from power broker to crowned sovereign. You see the culmination of years of relentless drive, cunning, and military triumph reduced to a single, audacious act. It's the point where the revolutionary general, who once championed liberty, embraces the mantle of empire, revealing the seductive gravitational pull of absolute authority and the need for historical legitimacy, however manufactured. The insight here is raw. Power abhors a vacuum, but it also craves ritual and symbol to solidify its hold, to tell a story of divine right or undeniable destiny, even when forged by mortal hands and iron will. As the trumpets blare and the choir sings, you understand that this isn't just about ruling. It's about reigning, about replacing one dynasty with another built solely on the force of one man's will. The reflection: is true power ever earned through democratic ideals? Or does it inevitably revert to the spectacle of kings, trading the chaos of freedom for the gilded cage of order? The weight of that crown isn't just gold and jewels. It's the crushing burden of expectation, the fear of a legacy built on a foundation that history has already tried to dismantle. Just a few years prior, you knew him as the First Consul, a powerful figurehead steering the volatile ship of the Republic through post-revolutionary storms. Now, that ship has been rebranded an empire, its captain demanding not just obedience, but allegiance to a new imperial order. You stand on the cobblestones of Paris and feel the air shift. It's not just political realignment. It's a change in the very texture of French life. The transition wasn't sudden. It was a calculated ascent, a slow siege against the lingering chaos that had defined France for a decade. It was fueled by the public's deep exhaustion with instability, the endless cycles of terror and uncertainty, and a palpable yearning for a strong hand to finally guide them. They craved not more freedom, but less fear. This pivot illustrates a core, often unsettling insight into leadership and societies. Sometimes, the very forces that elevate a revolutionary figure, disruption, radical change, the intoxicating promise of a new dawn, ultimately create the conditions where people, weary and battered, begin to crave the old comforts of stability, hierarchy, and even monarchy, albeit under a new, popular name. Napoleon didn't just seize power, he exploited this longing brilliantly, presenting the empire not as a step back towards the ancien regime he'd helped dismantle, but as the necessary fulfillment of the revolution's most basic promise: order out of chaos. He offered a crown as the final capstone on the revolutionary structure, arguing it secured the gains, not negated them. Here is the subtle, tragic irony. The man who rose by riding the revolutionary tide ultimately found his power solidified by redirecting that tide into the familiar channels of absolute rule. You see the calculation etched onto his face. The revolutionary fire is still there, but now it serves a different purpose, forging an imperial state. The reflection is stark, unavoidable. Does the fundamental human need for security eventually, inevitably, trump the arduous, often messy fight for freedom? And can a leader, forged in the crucible of revolution, steeped in its methods of forceful consolidation and total control, ever truly shed those very methods once power is achieved, even if it means betraying their initial ideals? You watch him transform, the uniform of a revolutionary general merely exchanged for the opulent robes of an emperor. The ruthless ambition remains the same, only the stage has expanded, demanding a grander, more absolute performance. Ask yourself, when the people ask for a savior, do they always end up creating a master? December 2nd, 1804. You stand in the hushed, cavernous expanse of Notre Dame Cathedral. Stone pillars rise like ancient sentinels towards the vaulted ceiling. The air is thick with incense and anticipation. In front of you, Pope Pius VII, heir to a lineage stretching back 2 millennia, sits in quiet solemnity, brought to Paris to perform a ritual that binds earthly power to divine blessing. The Holy Roman Emperor once knelt before the Pope. Kings throughout history sought this sacred touch to validate their reign. But today is different. Today belongs to Napoleon Bonaparte. He walks towards the altar, not with the humility of a supplicant, but with the measured stride of a conqueror claiming his spoils. Every eye in Europe, it feels, is fixed upon this stage. The crown itself, a golden laurel wreath designed to evoke the Caesars of Rome, rests upon the altar. The moment arrives. The Pope lifts the heavy imperial crown, ready to place it upon Napoleon's head. The traditional, symbolic act of the Church granting legitimacy. Then it happens. In a move so audacious, so profoundly defiant it steals the breath from the assembled dignitaries, Napoleon reaches out. His hand is quick, decisive. He takes the crown from the Pope's grasp. He doesn't wait to be given power. He takes it. With a deliberate, almost brutal finality, he turns and places the crown upon his own head. Silence hangs heavy in the air, punctuated only by the rustle of silks and the beating of hearts. He then turns to his wife, Josephine, kneeling before him, and crowns her empress. This wasn't impulsive. This was a carefully calculated piece of political theater, rehearsed meticulously beforehand. It was Napoleon's lightning strike of ambition made visible. He broadcasted a message across the continent, louder than any cannonade. My authority does not come from God, or from blood right, or even from the Church that sanctions monarchs. It comes from me. My legitimacy is self-made, forged in the crucible of revolution and battlefield victories. It is the ultimate declaration of the self-made man reaching for the heavens and pulling his own divinity down. The insight here is stark. True power, in Napoleon's worldview, isn't granted by ancient institutions or holy blessing. It is taken through will and action. It shows the chasm between leaders who seek external validation, who need the Pope's hand, the Parliament's vote, the people's cheer, and those who project absolute, unshakable self-belief, even to the point of symbolic heresy against centuries of tradition. Ask yourself, how much does presentation, this sheer, audacious spectacle, truly matter in the assertion of authority? And does an act of such public, dazzling self-aggrandizement reveal supreme confidence, or a deep-seated insecurity masked by an unforgettable show? You see the moment and understand. This empire answers to Napoleon, and Napoleon answers only to Napoleon. The paint is still drying in the grand halls of the Tuileries and the renovated palaces. The echoes of the coronation bells are barely fading. But the work for Napoleon is not over. It has just begun. You see him, consumed by a furious energy, orchestrating the construction of something more intricate than any fortress, the imperial machine. He understands that a crown is merely a symbol. Power requires structure. The creation of the imperial court is a spectacle of calculated design. Titles are not just bestowed, they are crafted with precision. Marshals are elevated, their battle-hardened loyalty rewarded with wealth and prestige. Dukes and princes are appointed, their new nobility forged not in ancient lineage, but in service to him. It's a conscious, almost ironic mimicry of the very Bourbon hierarchies the Revolution sought to dismantle. The old structures, the powdered wigs and rigid etiquette, are resurrected, but populated by men who weeks ago might have been strangers to such opulence. There is subtle wit in this. The man who rode the wave of egalitarian fervor now builds his own gilded hierarchy, proving that power often finds comfort in the forms it replaces. You watch as the emperor himself dictates the nuances of court life, the seating arrangements, the proper bowing angle, the uniforms that glitter with new insignias. It's a dizzying, sometimes awkward, elevation of loyal foot soldiers and capable administrators into a new aristocracy. This phase reveals a core truth of leadership. Authority isn't just about commanding armies. It's about creating the systems, the incentives, and the social fabric that bind an elite to your cause. By making them grand, he makes them dependent. Their status, their fortunes, their very identity is now inextricably linked to the survival of his regime. It's a brilliant, if cynical, application of patronage on a national scale. The surprising detail here is the sheer speed and thoroughness with which this new order is imposed, a testament to his administrative will as much as his military genius. He is building institutions, councils, ministries, systems of law. The Code Civil is his bedrock, but the administrative layers are the mortar and brick of this machine. This isn't merely pomp, it's the practical mechanics of perpetuating power, ensuring that loyalty is rewarded and dissent has no institutional toehold. Authority, he knows instinctively, needs systems to endure beyond the force of one man's will. But watching this intricate, demanding apparatus take shape, the question arises, does the creation of such elaborate structures inevitably lead to bureaucracy, disconnect, and the potential for the leader to become isolated within their own gilded cage? You see the machine being built, piece by piece, and you wonder if its complexity will eventually crush the very man who designed it. The news doesn't travel by rail or wire yet, but it flies on the wings of fear and indignation across the continent. From the gilded halls of Schönbrunn in Vienna to the foggy Thameside palaces of London, from the snow-dusted spires of St. Petersburg to the disciplined courts of Berlin, the message arrives with the force of a cannon shot. Bonaparte is emperor. You might have expected grudging acceptance, perhaps even weary resignation from the old guard. Instead, you feel the air crackle with something far more potent: universal, visceral outrage. In Vienna, Emperor Francis II sees not a fellow monarch, but a revolutionary upstart wearing borrowed robes, challenging the divine right of his ancient Habsburg line. In London, Pitt the Younger knows this coronation isn't just a change of title. It's a declaration that France, under this man, is a permanent, solidified threat aiming for continental dominance. Tsar Alexander I, initially intrigued, perhaps even charmed by Napoleon, now feels personally betrayed. A self-made soldier on a throne? It's an affront to the very order of God and kings they represent. The carefully constructed, centuries-old hierarchy of Europe trembles, then stiffens its resolve. This wasn't just about power, it was about legitimacy. A revolutionary republic, while dangerous, could be seen as an aberration, perhaps temporary. But an empire, founded by a non-royal general, legitimized not by blood, but by popularity and military might? That was a poison injected into the very concept of hereditary rule. It offered a terrifying alternative path to power, one that spoke directly to restless populations and ambitious generals within their own borders. You realize, with a chill, that the very act of trying to be a king has solidified the existing kings against you. It's a bitter irony. You sought to anchor your power in tradition, and tradition declared you an enemy. Ambassadors are recalled with haste. Couriers ride through the night carrying urgent dispatches. Secret meetings take place in candlelit rooms, discussing troop movements, naval blockades, and shared finances. The language is polite, formal, but the intent is sharp as a bayonet. The Third Coalition begins to take shape not just as a political alignment, but as a collective defense mechanism of the established world against a perceived existential threat. They aren't just fighting France anymore. They are fighting the dangerous precedent you represent. This is the unavoidable consequence of your ascent. Power consolidated through unconventional means is a direct challenge to those who already hold it. Your throne isn't just a symbol of your authority in Paris. It's a target drawn on the map of Europe. Ask yourself, was this brilliant strategic consolidation, or did the pomp and circumstance blind you to the inevitable backlash? What would you have done, standing in his boots, watching the storm clouds gather on the horizon, knowing the crown now sits heavy with the weight of coming conflict? The drumbeat of war, temporarily silenced after Amiens, begins anew, louder this time, closer. You can feel the tension rising across the map, realizing the empire you built is now a beacon for every enemy you've ever made. The scent of maquis hangs heavy in the air, a wild, stubborn fragrance clinging to a remote island, chafing under the weight of foreign rule. You stand on Corsica, land of proud, fierce people who resent being French, and you see a young boy, already intense, already apart. He carries the double burden of being from this resentful island, and then being thrust into the heart of the country that rules it, France. Here, among the privileged sons of the aristocracy, the penniless military student faces a different kind of battleground. The snickers, the mimicry of his thick accent, the casual disdain for his provincial origins. He walks the halls of the military academy, a ghost in their world, thin and serious, his intelligence burning like a solitary lamp in the mocking darkness. Every slight is a spark, igniting a fierce internal engine. This wasn't just ambition. It was a primal hunger. A need born not of wanting comfort, but of the gnawing feeling of being undervalued, overlooked, an outsider looking in with eyes that saw not just injustice, but opportunity carved from the very slights he endured. His destiny wasn't just a belief, it was a defiant declaration forged in the crucible of mockery and marginalization. He wasn't just Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the boy from Corsica with everything to prove to everyone, most of all himself. This is the surprising truth. The boundless energy, the ruthless efficiency, the refusal to accept limitations. Much of it springs from this wounded pride, this lifelong quest for the validation that felt ripped away in his youth. Power wasn't just a throne. It was the ultimate shield against the mockery, the loudest possible voice to silence the whispers of inadequacy he'd internalized. The insight here is stark. So many historical figures whose drive reshaped the world weren't simply born to command. They were often desperately trying to escape the shadows of perceived inferiority or a profound, unmet need for recognition. And here is the chilling reflection. When the fuel for your ascent is this intense, this personal, this rooted in overcoming deficit, does the hunger ever truly abate? Does the need for more proof, more power, more conquest become an insatiable beast that can never be quieted, no matter how many crowns you wear or empires you build? You look into the eyes of that young man, still stung by the slights, eyes blazing not just with potential, but with a consuming hunger that will define his path. A hunger that history shows will never dim, only grow into something both magnificent and monstrous. You stand in the vast, echoing halls of Notre Dame, the air thick with incense and the hushed awe of the assembled elite. You recall the fiery, chaotic streets just a decade prior, the roar of the crowds demanding liberté, égalité, fraternité. You remember the simple tricolor cockades, the citizens arming themselves, the executioner's blade falling on a king. Napoleon himself rose from that tempest, a general forged in the defense of that nascent republic. A champion celebrated for pushing back the old order, for speaking the language of the new era. But look around you now. The robes are heavy with imperial symbols. The language is of empire, of dynasty, of titles, marshals, princes, grand dignitaries. And there, at the altar, stands Napoleon, not receiving a crown from the Pope, but taking it in his own hands, placing it upon his own head. Then, turning, he crowns his empress. The ultimate act of self-made authority, yes, but also the symbolic death knell of the republic he once swore to defend. The ideal of the citizen, a unit of a collective sovereign nation, has been subtly, profoundly replaced by the reality of the subject, beholden to an emperor. This moment, this coronation, is more than a change of title. It's a brutal exhibition of how power, once attained, often demands the sacrifice of the very principles that facilitated its rise. The grand, inconvenient ideals of true equality and popular sovereignty become cumbersome obstacles to consolidating absolute control. Stability, yes, preventing a return to Bourbon rule, providing a clear line of succession. These are the justifications offered. Yet isn't it tragically ironic that the man who rode the wave of anti-monarchical sentiment now builds his own throne, constructs his own nobility, creates his own kings across Europe? It is the pragmatism, some would argue the stark cynicism, of a leader who understands that ruling is different from revolting. The revolutionary fire must be banked, controlled, or it might consume the leader himself. The deeper insight here is chillingly simple. Maintaining power often necessitates a compromise. sometimes a complete abandonment of the original vision. Napoleon needed the legitimacy that tradition, albeit a self-created tradition, could provide. He needed a structure of hierarchy to administer his vast domains, a loyalty based on patronage and title as much as merit. The path from revolutionary citizen to imperial subject is paved with these calculated compromises. Ask yourself, watching this spectacle, was this the necessary, albeit harsh, evolution required to bring stability to a bleeding nation? Or was it the ultimate betrayal, a leader prioritizing his own position, his own dynastic future, over the radical principles of the revolution he once championed? Ponder the cost, not just in treasure, but in the erosion of an ideal, the transformation from citizen to subject, and what that journey signifies for the nature of power itself. It is the grandest, most dazzling U-turn in modern history. The air in Paris is thick with a nervous energy, a decade of revolutionary fervor and bloody instability etched onto the city's weary face. The Committee of Public Safety is a chilling memory, the Directorate a chaotic farce. And now, after consolidating power, maneuvering through plots and plebiscites, Napoleon stands poised to make his final move, emperor. But how do you sell absolute rule to a people who just overthrew a monarchy? You listen as the arguments unfurl. A carefully crafted symphony of necessity and fear. The rhetoric is persuasive, appealing directly to the French soul, battered but not broken. The justification for this drastic step is presented not as a grasping for ultimate power, but as a reluctant, even sacrificial duty. The empire, Napoleon argues through his proxies and propaganda, is the only bulwark against the return of the Bourbons, those ghosts of the Ancien regime who hunger to reclaim their throne and punish the revolutionaries. He reminds the nation of the terror, of the constant internal squabbles, the guillotine's hungry blade, all products of instability. The empire is painted as the antidote, the strong hand needed to impose order out of the chaos that has plagued France for 10 long years. Beyond internal threats, there are the external enemies. Europe's monarchs, resentful of France's republican experiment, perpetually threaten invasion. The empire, with its centralized authority and unified command under its proven military genius, becomes the indispensable shield, guaranteeing security and defending the gains of the revolution. The abolition of feudalism, the promise of equality before the law, at least for some. This transformation, from First Consul to Emperor, is framed as a service to the nation, the ultimate guarantee of lasting peace and prosperity. It's a masterful inversion, ambition disguised as selflessness, control as salvation. This is a classic play from the autocrat's handbook. Leverage fear and the deep human desire for security to justify the erosion of freedom. By constantly hammering home the specter of the past, the threat of enemies without and within, the leader makes their own ascent seem like the only logical safe path. The offer is clear. Trade your potential liberties for guaranteed stability. You hear the persuasive words, feel the undercurrent of exhaustion in the populace, the craving for an end to uncertainty. And you wonder, how many truly believed this was solely for France's sake? How many simply saw the promise of sleep after a decade of nightmares and willingly closed their eyes? It's a chilling insight into the psychology of power and populace alike. Ask yourself, when does the need for security become a tool for manipulation? Convincing a nation to exchange hard-won liberty for the comforting, if illusory, embrace of absolute order. The argument is made. The stage is set. The empire rises on a foundation of fear, necessity, and a carefully constructed narrative of service. You walk the long, polished floors of the Tuileries Palace. The echoes of the coronation have faded, replaced by the low hum of a different kind of power, the ceaseless, administrative grind of empire. The scepter you held on the altar felt heavy, yes, a symbol of divine right and earthly dominion. But this is the true weight. It settles on your shoulders, not in a single dramatic instant, but in 1,000 small, relentless pressures. Through these grand halls, you are a magnet for needs, demands, and crises. Ambassadors from distant courts, their faces etched with geopolitical chess moves. Ministers like Fouché, his smile a thin veil over hidden motives, presenting police reports and whispering conspiracies. Generals, fresh from triumphs or demanding resources for the next campaign. Petitioners, seeking justice, favor, or simply a moment of your time. They gather, they wait, they present, and for each one, there is a decision to be made. A treaty clause to approve, a spy network to fund, an army division to move, a citizen's fate to determine. There is no council whose consensus you must await, no senate to debate the fine points, no higher authority to consult. The buck, in its terrifying finality, stops here, on your desk, in your mind. This is the isolation that comes with the purple robes. Surrounded by supplicants, advisors, even supposed friends, you are utterly, profoundly alone in the ultimate choice. Their counsel is filtered through their own ambitions. Their loyalty is a variable currency. The stakes are no longer just your reputation or victory in battle. They are the livelihoods of millions, the borders of nations, the fragile peace of a continent. An error isn't just a setback. It could unravel everything you've built. It's a unique form of solitude, breeding a cold caution, perhaps even paranoia. Trust becomes a luxury you can barely afford. Every piece of information, every word spoken, must be weighed, questioned, cross-referenced. You are the spider at the center of a vast web, feeling every tremor but disconnected from the individual strands. The surprising truth isn't that absolute power corrupts absolutely, but perhaps that it absolutely isolates. You fought for control, seized it with audacious ambition, and now control demands your absolute servitude. The empire isn't just a crown you wear, it's a voracious entity that consumes your time, your energy, your peace of mind. The freedom you might have imagined at the summit is an illusion. You are a prisoner of the structure you created, bound by its needs, its threats, its endless hunger. Look at the man walking these halls. Is this the triumphant conqueror or the overburdened administrator? Ask yourself, is this pinnacle of power truly desirable when it walls you off from genuine connection and burdens you with the sheer, crushing weight of the world? Does the very act of reigning supreme make the ruler not the master, but the ultimate servant of their own design? You see him there, amidst the grandeur, the most powerful man in Europe, and perhaps the most solitary. The scepter doesn't just confer power, it imposes an ultimate, lonely servitude. You step into the gilded halls of the Tuileries, the heart of the new imperial court. The air is thick with silk, perfume, and a palpable, almost comic tension. You see men forged in the fire of revolution, scarred veterans who once debated radical ideas in smoky cafes, now navigating the intricate dance of courtly bows and whispers. These are your marshals, Davout, Berthier, lands, giants of the battlefield, now awkwardly encased in velvet and ermine, elevated to dukes and princes. Their rough hands, more accustomed to gripping a sword hilt or signing death warrants, fumble with ornate snuff boxes. This is Napoleon's grand experiment in forging a new nobility, binding the heroes of the age to his throne, not just with loyalty, but with titles and vast wealth. It's a chess game where pieces are moved not just for strategic advantage, but for personal reward, transforming the revolutionary army into a dynastic court. But look closer. Beyond the marshals, you see Napoleon's own siblings. Joseph, crowned King of Spain, a gentle soul struggling to impose order on a fiercely rebellious nation. Louis, made King of Holland, attempting to govern with some independence, much to his imperial brother's frustration. Jerome, the youngest, given Westphalia, more interested in lavish parties than governance. And Elisa, Caroline, Pauline, all given principalities, duchesses, queens, each jostling for position, wealth, and their brother's unpredictable favor. This isn't just a court, it's a vast family business sprawled across Europe, with Napoleon as the demanding patriarch. His logic is clear. Who can be more loyal than family? Elevate them, empower them, and they become extensions of his will, securing conquered territories through blood ties. Yet, you see the flaw in this design unfold daily. The elevation of family introduces staggering incompetence into positions of power. Joseph is overwhelmed in Spain. Louis actively defies his brother, sympathizing with his Dutch subjects. The sisters are consumed by vanity and intrigue. Loyalty, it turns out, does not automatically translate to capability or obedience, especially when combined with entitlement. Holding these relatives accountable becomes near impossible. They are the emperor's flesh and blood, shielded by their status, even as their failings create administrative chaos and resentment among more capable, non-royal officials. The tangled web of family ambition and statecraft is a breeding ground for internal conflict. You watch as court factions form, not along political lines, but around who is married to which sibling, whose territory is more profitable, whose children might marry into old European royalty. It's a constant, low-level hum of rivalry and resentment beneath the veneer of imperial unity. This decision to build a dynasty on family roots, born from the ambition to create a legacy that rivals the old Bourbon or Habsburg lines, paradoxically introduces fundamental weaknesses. It prioritizes blood over merit in the very structure meant to govern an empire built by talent and force. The question hangs heavy in the air of these opulent, yet insecure halls. Can true meritocracy survive when power is consolidated through family ties? Or does the desire to build a lasting dynasty ultimately weaken the very empire it's meant to secure, planting the seeds of its own destruction from within? You see marshals stumble through courtly bows and hear whispers of royal siblings plotting petty rebellions. A bizarre, glittering spectacle of power struggling against the very bonds it sought to strengthen. This is the cost of confusing family with the state, a costly lesson learned in gilded cages. The weight of the imperial crown settles not just on your head, but on your very soul. You placed it there yourself, a deliberate, unprecedented act. And in that moment, something shifts deep within. The belief in your destiny, which had been a driving force, a calculated tool, now solidifies into an unshakable dogma. You are no longer just a brilliant general, a shrewd politician. You are, in your own eyes, anointed, chosen by a force larger than history itself. The vast spectacle of Notre Dame, the cheering crowds, the bowing potentates, they are not merely affirming your power. They are confirming this profound, self-generated truth. You are a man set apart. This is the dangerous precipice. Success, validated by such a magnificent display, begins to warp the landscape of reality. The calculated risk-taker starts to believe the rules no longer fully apply to him. Caution seems less like wisdom and more like a lack of faith in one's own inevitable triumph. Advisors who urge restraint or point out potential pitfalls sound increasingly like naysayers, blind to the cosmic certainty of your path. Your judgment, once sharp and grounded, now begins to acquire a slight, perilous blur, seen through the golden haze of absolute self-conviction. The coronation wasn't just about creating a dynasty for France. It was about cementing in your own mind the image of an invincible force. Consider the subtle irony. The pinnacle of earthly power, achieved through sheer human will and genius, becomes the catalyst for believing you are guided by divine right, no longer needing earthly counsel. You sense the internal shift from bending reality to your will through strategy to believing reality itself must bend because you are you. Ask yourself, was this hardening of belief the final, necessary ingredient for your most audacious campaigns? Or the first crack in the foundation of your eventual downfall? When does supreme confidence transition into blinding hubris? When does believing in your destiny prevent you from seeing the changing realities of the world around you, deafening you to the rumblings of discontent and the shifting alliances you could once predict with chilling accuracy? The aura of destiny is solidified, yes, but sometimes the hardest steel is also the most brittle. The air in the map room is thick with power. You stand by the immense table, its surface a patchwork of colors and borders you helped to draw in ink and blood. But now, the lines are bolder, the colors deeper. The man bent over it isn't merely a general planning a campaign or a statesman seeking terms. He is the emperor, and the maps before him are no longer guides to negotiation, but blueprints for absolute dominion. Watch him. He doesn't ponder, he decrees. A flick of the wrist redraws a border. A sharp command dissolves a centuries-old state. A scowl dismisses the plight of millions whose lives are mere statistics on the parchment. The resistance encountered in conquered lands, the quiet grumbling in forced alliances, these are not seen as legitimate political opposition or national pride. No. To the imperial mind, resistance is treason. It is defiance against the ordained order he embodies. The earlier flexibility, the shrewd calculation that balanced power and necessity, the willingness to concede a minor point for a major gain, it evaporates like mist under a relentless sun. Consider the continental system. It wasn't a nuanced economic strategy debated amongst peers. It was a declaration of will. Europe will cease trade with Britain because the emperor commands it. The economic devastation wrought on allies and vassals, the impossible demands placed on their fragile economies, the widespread smuggling and resentment it bred. These were mere inconveniences to be crushed by force. You see the armies marching, not just to defeat enemy forces, but to enforce economic policy, to stamp out dissent born of empty bellies and ruined livelihoods. It's a chilling insight. The same iron will that forged an empire can become a brittle inability to understand the world outside one's own perspective. The subtle art of diplomacy, the patience required for compromise, the empathy needed to build lasting relationships. These are luxuries for lesser men, not for the architect of a new world order. The challenges he faces are no longer intricate problems demanding clever solutions. They are simply obstacles proving insufficient force has been applied. The expectation is not agreement, but submission. Look closely at his hands, moving across the map. They draw lines with absolute certainty, dividing kingdoms, carving out satellite states, assuming the world must and will bend to his design, ignoring the brewing storms beneath the surface. There's a tragic irony here. The very ambition that unified a fractured nation now seeks to control an entire continent, and in doing so, sows the seeds of its own isolation. Ask yourself, does achieving such supreme power inevitably lead to a form of political blindness, an inability to see the world from any perspective other than your own? And how does this imperial tunnel vision, this absolute faith in one's own will, inexorably pave the road towards conflict and utter isolation? The emperor on the map believes he is playing chess. He doesn't see that he is setting the entire board ablaze. He sits before a map, not of battlefields, but of a continent he intends to reshape entirely, not through negotiation, but imposition. The ink isn't yet dry on decrees installing his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain, ignoring centuries of history and national pride. Simultaneously, he tightens the knots of the continental system, a vast economic embargo meant to strangle Britain, but which instead slowly chokes the life out of economies across Europe, including his allies. These aren't the cautious steps of a consul securing borders. They are the sweeping, arrogant gestures of an emperor convinced of his divine right to dictate the very structure of nations. You see the principle of imperial inertia taking hold. The coronation wasn't an endpoint, a state of achieved glory. It was a launching pad. The immense power consolidated demands constant validation, constant expansion. Like a vast, powerful machine, it needs ever more fuel, new territories to organize, new peoples to govern, new rivals to subdue. Spain becomes less a nation with its own identity and more a strategic piece on a grand chessboard. The economies of Hamburg, Naples, Amsterdam become levers in a global economic war. This need to constantly assert control, to impose his will upon the world, seems almost inherent in the imperial title itself. The confidence born of unprecedented success, cemented by the crown, morphs subtly into an inability to tolerate dissent or independence. The irony is sharp, almost tragic. In seeking absolute control over Spain, he ignites a vicious, protracted guerrilla war that bleeds his armies and his treasury for years, a war he famously calls his Spanish ulcer. The attempt to control Europe's trade routes through the continental system breeds resentment and defiance, pushing nations like Russia to break ranks, setting the stage for his most catastrophic miscalculation. These initiatives, born from the conviction of total authority, are the very actions that begin to stretch the empire thin, revealing the limits of even his formidable power. The shadow stretches further across the map, yes, but you can see the light starting to penetrate the edges. Look at the pressure building, the friction in Spain, the economic pain across the continent. Ask yourself, is this still strategic genius at work? Or is it the pursuit of total control, planting the seeds of its own destruction? When does the ambition to dominate transition from calculated strategy to a blinding compulsion that ignores the fundamental realities of human nature and national will? You watch him make these moves, so certain, so decisive, and a chill sets in. He seems less like a man directing the storm, and more like a man trapped within its ever-expanding eye. The dust of the revolution settles not into the promised landscape of egalitarian dawn, but solidifies under the weight of a new throne. You watch as the First Consul becomes emperor, a transformation that feels less like an evolution and more like an outright betrayal of the very forces that propelled him. The paradox is stark, almost painful to witness. The man who embodied the seismic power of the people to shatter divine right and hereditary rule now establishes his own dynasty, building a court that increasingly mirrors the elaborate, stifling ancien regime his revolution overthrew. The revolutionary energy, that wild, uncontrollable flame that swept across Europe, is not extinguished, but captured, contained, and channeled into the construction of his personal empire, a structure designed not for liberty, but for order, efficiency, and expansion under a single will. You see the tricolor, once a banner of radical change, now fluttering over ceremonies of imperial grandeur, where marshals wear plumed hats and titles are resurrected or invented to serve the new hierarchy. It's a tragic arc etched into the stone of history. Revolutionary movements, born of chaos and upheaval, often crave stability so desperately that they empower figures strong enough to restore order. Figures who, in their pursuit of control, invariably recreate the very structures they fought to dismantle, albeit under a new, often more brutal guise. The insight here is profound and chilling. The forces unleashed by revolution are monstrously difficult to control or contain. They rip apart the old world, but often pave the way for strongmen who prioritize their own power and the facade of order over the fragile, messy ideals of the initial uprising. Napoleon, the savior of the revolution, becomes its architect, but also its ultimate jailer, redirecting its fury outwards in conquest, consuming its internal fire in the construction of his imperial state. A surprising detail? While Napoleon dismantled many remnants of feudalism and established the Code Napoleon, a truly revolutionary legal framework, he also brought back state censorship, secret police, and nepotism, placing family members on foreign thrones. The same man who championed careers open to talent created an imperial nobility based on service to him. The irony is thick enough to cut with a guillotine. Ask yourself, was this inevitable? Does the pursuit of order after chaos invariably lead back to forms of centralized control that betray the spirit of the initial uprising? You watch the vibrant revolutionary flame slowly extinguish, replaced brick by painstaking brick by the cold, hard, polished stone of the imperial palace, a monument to ambition that devoured the revolution it claimed to protect. You stand in Notre Dame Cathedral, December 2nd, 1804. The air is thick with incense and destiny. The Pope is here. The aristocracy is back, kneeling before you. You reach out, take the iron crown of Lombardy, then the laurel wreath of the French emperors, and place it upon your own head. This single defiant gesture, eschewing the Pope, claiming legitimacy solely through your own power and the will you perceive in the nation, encapsulates the very essence that propelled you from obscurity to absolute rule. The unyielding will, the supreme confidence, the refusal to allow anyone, not even the representative of God on earth, to bestow your power. This moment, the pinnacle of your ascent, is also, subtly, the start of the fatal trajectory the prompt describes. The same qualities that seized the crown would, over the next decade, chart a course toward the frozen plains of Russia in 1812, a crucible where that unyielding will met an unyielding winter, and ultimately to the muddy fields of Waterloo in 1815, where supreme confidence finally met an unyielding coalition. The refusal to back down, once your greatest strength on the battlefield and in the council chambers, transformed into an inability to recognize limits, to admit strategic error, or to compromise when the tide inevitably turned. Consider the shift. The ambition that drove you to conquer became an insatiable appetite for control, pushing the empire's borders past breaking points. The ruthlessness needed to navigate revolutionary chaos became a disregard for the immense human cost of endless warfare. The self-belief that inspired armies and redrew maps calcified into a dangerous hubris, blinding you to the exhaustion of your people, the shifting alliances against you, and the sheer, brutal reality of nature in the Russian winter. Here is the tragic irony. The very traits that enabled you to forge an empire of unprecedented scale were precisely the traits that made you incapable of leading it sustainably. You could seize power, but you could not temper its exercise. You could command armies to victory, but you could not command yourself to yield or adapt when faced with insurmountable odds. The insight is stark. The characteristics that forge an empire are often the same characteristics that lead to its downfall, especially when wielded without restraint or self-awareness. Ask yourself, how do the traits that make someone a successful disruptor or conqueror fundamentally prevent them from being a stable, long-term leader? Does the pinnacle of power inherently amplify a leader's fatal flaws, turning strengths into brittle weaknesses? You watch the line, drawn from the crown, extending now, cold and clear, towards ultimate defeat and exile. The descent has begun, etched in the ice of Russia and the mud of Belgium. The wind whips across the stark volcanic rock of St. Helena. You stand not on a throne, but on a lonely plateau overlooking an ocean that stretches endlessly, a vast, indifferent blue prison. The grand robes of empire are a memory, the polished scepter, a crude walking stick. You are Napoleon, but the power, the title, the very essence of emperor has been stripped away, leaving only the man. Here, in this bitter exile, the echoes of coronations and cannonades fade, replaced by the relentless murmur of the waves and the silence within. This is where the accounts are settled, not with armies, but with memory. Hour after hour, you dictate, you write, you justify. The marshals parade through your mind. Linez, Davout, Berthier, ghosts of campaigns won and lost. You revisit Austerlitz, Marengo, Jena, seeing them not just as triumphs, but as steps on a stair that inevitably led to this desolate rock. Waterloo is replayed endlessly, the what-ifs a cruel torment. But beneath the military post-mortem lies a deeper, more painful excavation, a confrontation with the core ambition that drove it all. Was it France you sought to serve, or the insatiable hunger for power itself? Was the grand design for Europe a vision of enlightened unity, or merely a stage for your own colossal ego? The world you forged is gone, fractured along the lines of national resistance you so often underestimated. Spain, Russia, Germany, the spirit of nations you sought to command or extinguish proved more resilient than your armies. You see now, perhaps with a clarity impossible from the gilded cage of the Tuileries, that ultimate control is an illusion. The decrees from the imperial palace could command armies across continents, rearrange borders, crown kings, but they could not command the tides of history, the will of a determined populace, or the simple, relentless erosion of time and distance. The empire you built, solidified with blood and iron, held together by your singular force of will, proved transient. The power, absolute at its zenith, has proven utterly fleeting. A surprising detail from this time: despite the outward calm or the focus on dictating memoirs, those closest observed moments of profound despair, even petty squabbles over scarce comforts, revealing that even the Titan of Europe was subject to the grinding indignities of confinement, a stark counterpoint to the myth of the stoic, unbreakable leader he cultivated. The grand ambition, the relentless drive to consolidate all authority under your banner, now feels like a desperate, ultimately doomed race against these enduring forces. You chase total dominion across Europe, rearranging its very fabric like pieces on a chessboard. Yet a few thousand miles of ocean and the collective will of rivals proved a barrier stronger than any fortress. The principle of consolidated power, so potent in your hands, is revealed in exile as terrifyingly fragile. It demands constant vigilance, endless expansion, and the suppression of any competing force. A battle that can never truly be won, because its opponent is the inherent complexity and resistance of reality itself. Ask yourself, reflecting on this figure staring out at the ocean, what is the true measure of a life spent accumulating such power? Does the inevitable loss of control, the shattering of the carefully constructed edifice, make the immense struggle to achieve it seem ultimately futile? You see the deposed emperor, stripped of everything but his name and his memories, and you begin to understand. The greatest empires, the truly enduring ones, are perhaps built not just with strength and ambition, but with a fundamental wisdom about limits, limits of geography, limits of human endurance, limits of how much control one individual can possibly wield over the vast, unpredictable current of history. It is a wisdom Napoleon, crowned and supreme, ultimately lacked, and for which he paid the ultimate price on this barren rock. You step back from the history books, from the dramatic scenes in Notre Dame, the coronation crown held aloft, or the windswept, lonely rock of St. Helena. The story of Napoleon's meteoric rise, his consolidation of seemingly absolute power culminating in the imperial crown, and his eventual crushing fall is far more than just a historical narrative. It is a timeless, resonant parable about the very nature of ambition itself. It forces you to confront the seductive, dangerous allure of control, the intoxicating, often blinding belief in one's own singular destiny, and the profound, devastating consequences that inevitably follow when these elemental forces are unleashed without restraint. The principle illuminated by his self-coronation, that the ultimate act of consolidating power, the moment designed to eternally secure one's position atop the world, can simultaneously and ironically plant the insidious seeds of isolation, overreach, and eventual spectacular downfall. Echoes sharp and clear, through the marble corridors of power in every age, every nation, every organization. You see leaders today, driven by that same insatiable hunger, striving for absolute control, building their own versions of empire, be it corporate monoliths, political dynasties, or even intensely controlled personal domains. You see the same tired justifications for centralized power, the same reliance on spectacle and manufactured awe, the same desperate struggles with loyalty, betrayal, and crippling isolation. What if history doesn't just repeat itself in grand battles or geopolitical shifts, but in the fundamental, unchanging human drives that motivated Napoleon, that motivate us? What if the ambition that lifts individuals to the highest, most dizzying peaks contains inherently the very elements, the hubris, the blindness to limits that will inevitably ensure their eventual, perhaps tragic, descent? His life, laid bare by history, compels us to ask the uncomfortable questions. What is the true, final cost of wielding such power? Is it worth the crushing isolation at the top, the relentless, universal opposition, the potential for catastrophic, world-altering failure? You see Napoleon on St. John Cock, Helena, stripped of his army, his empire, his glory, grappling with the cold, hard ruins of his once indomitable dreams. He once famously declared, in the blazing heat of his power, "Death is nothing, but to live defeated and inglorious is to die daily." Yet in that desolate final exile, facing years of quiet, inescapable consequence, perhaps he learned a different, far more chilling truth, that living defeated, stripped of glory and spectacle, but faced with the stark, unvarnished reality of one's choices and their price, might just be the ultimate inescapable cost of a life lived without acknowledging limits, without respecting the delicate balance of the world. The echoes of his ambition aren't confined to dusty historical texts. They resonate, a quiet, persistent hum, in every human heart that has ever yearned for more, asking us, even now, to consider carefully where that boundless path truly leads.